The Vietnam War has become an iconic conflict, a poster child for anti-war movement and the horrors and hardships of modern warfare. It undoubtedly left its mark on contemporary culture, but today, only people over 50 have any recollection of what it was really like during that time. The Vietnam War has been used as a backdrop for many films and TV shows that has become a part of our zeitgeist, despite many people being removed from the actual event. With that in mind, join us while we count down 7 ways the Vietnam War changed the world. Number 7. It changed how people felt about the government. Before the Vietnam War, many countries had faith in their governments. If their elected leaders took the country to war, it must be the right course of action. Vietnam exposed the lies of politicians and kicked off a period of political disengagement that continues to this day. While it can be argued that this distrust in government grew in multiple countries, it hit America the hardest. Before Vietnam, serving one's country was at the heart of American life. Afterward, many Americans no longer trusted their leaders to steer them in the right direction. When American troops first landed in Vietnam, President Lyndon B. Johnson denied that America was going to war. He insisted they were merely protecting key installations in their continuing support of South Vietnam. When it was clear that more troops were heading for Vietnam, the Johnson administration insisted the war would be won in 6 months, and that Vietnam had to be kept out of communist hands. If it fell, it was believed a domino effect would cause all the surrounding nations to become communist. In time, it was clear that neither of these things was true. The lies continued throughout the war, but with new media outlets allowing civilians access to more information, it was shown that the government's words were not reflected in their actions. Before the war, JFK proclaimed, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." After the war, many asked, "What has our country done for us?" Number 6. It changed the outcome of the Cold War. The external involvement in the Vietnam War was undeniably linked to the Cold War and the conflict between capitalism and communism. After World War II, colonial empires were falling, and nationalism was rising in these newly liberated countries, often in the guise of communism. In the US, which had capitalism built into its foundations, communism became the next enemy to unite against. When North Vietnam became communist, President John F. Kennedy sent advisors to South Vietnam to support the capitalist republic. Throughout the Vietnam War, Cold War tensions grew. Ultimately, it could be said that America's fear of communism blinded it to the nuances of the power struggles in formerly colonized countries. In essence, communism in Vietnam had more to do with nationalism and moving away from French rule. But America had linked it with the USSR, its main global competitor after World War II. During the 1960s, the Soviet Union had built up its nuclear capabilities. Soon, a fear of the Soviets and mutually assured destruction had replaced the fear of communism. It wasn't until the Nixon administration that America realized the variety of communist causes, which led the U.S. to formally recognize the People's Republic of China under President Jimmy Carter. This act de-escalated the tension, and when America began to pull its troops out of Vietnam under Nixon, the atmosphere of the Cold War shifted from conflict to diplomacy. Realizing that the war in Vietnam may be unwinnable, Nixon ushered in a period called the détente, which eased the tension of the Cold War and increased trade between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. This proclamation of détente meant that America could pull troops from Vietnam without admitting they lost the war. Had America won in Vietnam or continued to send troops in, it is possible that the Cold War might have moved from political maneuvering to actual armed combat. Number 5. It changed how the Army honored its soldiers. In World War II, around 6,000 soldiers died without being identified, and the plight of individual soldiers and their families was largely left out of newspaper reports. The military honored those who fought bravely and killed large numbers of the enemy, with the onus solely on those who attacked. However, as the Vietnam War came to a close, the military, particularly the American Armed Forces, began to focus on their soldiers as people rather than mere instruments of war. This change reflected the massive civilian backlash to the war that was partially a result of the reports that thousands of U.S. military personnel had lost their lives. The armed forces began giving medals for defensive actions, not just combat prowess. Those that defended their fellow soldiers, rather than those who strictly helped the war effort, were awarded medals of honor. This shift changed how the military viewed bravery, honor, and the individual soldiers themselves. In addition, the military also relaxed its approach to discipline, allowing for more individual expression within the army, puts focus on the person rather than the soldier, humanizing the troops, and allowing their lives to have more value. The American military started visiting the family members of deceased soldiers to deliver the sad news in person rather than via telegram, demonstrating higher respect for those who lost their lives and their families. Number 4. It changed how the world saw America. The Vietnam War's most significant impact on the world was how it affected America's standing on the global stage. Not only had America come under extreme internal and external scrutiny for its role, but struggling in a war against a country that the U.S. had proclaimed to be full of uneducated farmers damaged its credibility massively. Before the war, America was a beacon of hope and prosperity for many. But above all, it was fair in war. America, it seemed, would not enter into war lightly, but would give support only when it became unbearable not to fight the good fight. However, now this great country was dropping napalm on farmers whose only crime was being born in the wrong part of Vietnam. While many other countries were involved in the Vietnam War, the Americans were truly tarnished by the conflict. The French had started the war in an effort to maintain their colony in Vietnam. In Australia, New Zealand, the Republic of South Korea, Thailand, and the Philippines all sent troops to fight against North Vietnam. However, the rate at which the Americans sent troops to Vietnam was unprecedented. When their domino effect theory was proven false, many questioned the validity of the scale of American involvement and their dubious war tactics. Number 3. It changed international rules about chemical warfare. Chemical warfare was by no means new or unique to the Vietnam War and has been used throughout recorded history. In World War I, the modern form of chemical weapons came into play and became classed as weapons of mass destruction. After the First World War, many world leaders recognized the need to control and ban the use of these horrific weapons. At the 1925 Geneva Convention, most of the world's states signed an agreement that they would not employ chemical weapons. However, this didn't stop countries from developing or producing them. During the Vietnam War, the Americans had developed chemical weapons that attacked plants instead of people, thus giving the impressions that they were safer than the suffocating gases that had been used during the World Wars. They had developed the so-called rainbow herbicides, designed to damage cultivated lands and ecosystems in an attempt to induce surrender from North Vietnam. The Americans hoped to damage crops that fed the Viet Cong forces and destroy the forests that concealed them. The destruction of the Vietnamese ecosystem is tragic enough, but the problem was the herbicides didn't just damage plants. The most notorious of the herbicides was Agent Orange, but there were others, including Agents Blue, White, Pink, Green, and Purple. Around 13 million gallons of Agent Orange were sprayed on the countryside of Vietnam. The main issue with Agent Orange was that it contained a byproduct of the manufacturing process, commonly known as dioxin. Dioxin is highly toxic, even in small amounts, and the herbicide dropped on Vietnam held 375 pounds of the stuff. During the 1970s, Vietnamese civilians began to develop skin disorders and cancers, and cases of miscarriages rose, as did congenital disabilities and malformations. These inflictions were linked to the use of Agent Orange, and it wasn't just the Vietnamese that suffered. U.S., Australian, and New Zealander service members later developed health disorders and cancers after having long-term exposure to the chemical concoctions. The use of rainbow herbicides in Vietnam led to the UN prohibiting the hostile use of environmental modification techniques at a convention in 1976. Number 2. It changed how people reacted to war. Before the Vietnam War, many civilians saw war as a necessary evil. Signing up was a noble pursuit, and people generally supported their country's war efforts. However, Vietnam changed all that. As the war waged on and the death count rose, people started to question the morality and validity of the Vietnam War. Cases of conscientious objectors rose as people resisted military service because fighting in Vietnam went against their personal beliefs. However, historically, Conscientious objection was tied to religious beliefs rather than moral ones, and the U.S. government prosecuted many conscientious objectors for failing to comply with draft orders. This action fueled objections to the war and widened the chasm between those who still felt military service was a duty and the rising number of people who believed it should be a choice. Nowadays, civilians more readily question the validity of wars and openly explore their government's motives without blindly following the proposed status quo. Number 1. It changed how civilians viewed war. Today, we are bombarded with images of war-torn countries and the suffering of civilians trapped in these areas. So much so that perhaps we are becoming more detached from the reality of the situation and dulled to the real horror of it. But during Vietnam, civilians had never seen war firsthand. Before the Vietnam War, very little real-time information reached the average civilian. But Vietnam became the first war with large-scale news coverage. Images of the battles spread worldwide and were beamed directly into people's homes. By 1968, around 600 journalists were in Vietnam, producing copy or imagery for radio, television, and newspapers. Vietnam is often referred to as the first television war, and many believe that the media coverage contributed to America's ultimate defeat. Yet experts who have studied the media's role in Vietnam concluded that it actually supported the U.S. cause in Vietnam, and it was the death toll that undermined the public support. What is undeniable is that this was the first time people who were physically far removed from a war still felt part of it. It humanized the military personnel putting their lives on the line and made people wonder if the cause was worth the cost. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about the Vietnam War, check out our book, Vietnam War, A Captivating Guide to the Second Indochina War. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you found the video captivating, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.